Uh, I do want to take a minute to thank some of the co-sponsors of this event that have worked with us. So the Department of Economics, the Department of Philosophy, Department of Political Science, and the Department of Marketing, Supply Chain Management, and Economics at the Citadel. These guys are in force, right? I appreciate all of them coming out. While we're doing this, since we are both live and virtual, if people have questions, for those who are virtual, they can put them in the chat. We have someone monitoring them, and at the end, we'll do those as part of our Q&A. So please make sure that you're putting those in. For those of you who are not familiar, the mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And we do this through a variety of programming here at the College of Charleston. And through our center, we have obviously the Free Market Speaker Series, we have the Economics Book Colloquium, and we were fortunate enough today, we're reading Dr. Powell's book and have him come and sit in with our students. And we're fortunate when we can have that happen. We have Adam Smith Week, which is probably one of our most marquee events and is probably the most recognized of our events. It's a week-long seminar series of speakers and events going on that happens every spring. And then, of course, we have our Market Process Scholars. This is our mentoring program. This is the way students get directly involved in the center. They get an opportunity to do research, to meet with entrepreneurs, to do professional development. And so I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about the center, to grab some of the information that's on the tables on your way out. If you are here because you've been so induced, you may want to also take note of, as this slide goes around, there is one of them that has survey, and I'll put this up at the end, but we want feedback, but this might also be useful for your professors, because we'll be sending that out information to them as well if they've encouraged you and so induced you to, incentivized you to attend. I would ask that you also take note of our further events. Look at that, perfect timing, right? Later on this month, we're going to be doing a screening a documentary over 2 nights with the producer, Patrick Reason, over this is They Say It Can't Be Done, which deals with entrepreneurship and regulatory issues, dealing with social issues that are paramount to us right now. So I would encourage you to come out and back out to those events. At this point, I want to bring up Lucas Moyen, who's one of our market process scholars, to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. C. I will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Benjamin Powell, for this evening. I was really hoping to memorize the introduction, but it's really long. He's a really accomplished guy, so I do have a sheet of paper here to help me. Dr. Benjamin Powell is the Executive Director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University and Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business and a Senior Fellow with the Independent Institute. He is the Secretary Treasurer of both the Southern Economic Association and the Association of Private Enterprise Education and the Treasurer of the Mont Pelerin Society. Dr. Powell earned a BS in Economics and Finance from the University of Massachusetts of Lowell and his MA and Ph.D. in Economics from George Mason University. He's the author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops in the Global Economy, co-author of Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, and of the Amazon best-selling book, Socialism Sucks, a book that many students at the College of Charleston School of Business have read in preparation for this talk. He's the editor or co-editor of 5 other books, including The Economics of Immigration, Market-Based Approaches, Social Science and Public Policy, and has produced over 75 scholarly articles and policy studies. His findings have been published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and The Economist, as well as many other outlets. And he's appeared numerous times on radio and television shows, including Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, Showtime, CNBC, and is a regular guest commentator on Fox News's Freedom Business Watch and Stossel. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Powell to the College of Charleston.
All right. Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Pete and B and everybody for helping to bring me here tonight. I'm really pleased to be back here and talking with you. This is the second visit to College of Charleston, and I took a photo in the lobby on the way in from my first visit to College of Charleston, which is on a portrait up in the atrium there from lecturing, and apparently Pete was the only one who actually responded when the college was like, anybody have stock photos of lectures on campus? And that's how I ended up there. But actually, I think this is a tradition that's great for Pete, for all of the speakers that he brings in. So all of my friends have to take a picture of me in the lobby as they come through. So that makes it extra fun for me to be here tonight. So I'm going to talk to you today about my most recent book, Wretched Refuse, Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions. In it, we explore what I view as the most important potential objection to greater flows of immigration coming into the United States and other destination countries. It's an objection that posits that immigrants might bring with them traits that would undermine the productivity of the destination country. If true, this would significantly undermine a case for having greater immigration. Now, this is one objection to immigration. Immigration is a contentious issue. For people in the United States here, you're used to hearing all sorts of different objections to immigration. And there's plenty of problems that come with migration. But for most of them, if the economic gains are anywhere near as big as economists estimate, and I'll go over those in just a minute, most of these problems are second order problems, things that could be addressed in ways that don't involve shutting off flows of migration. The one I'm going to discuss in more detail tonight is one that, if true, can't get solved that way, actually. And we're going to give it a fair hearing and see what we think about it. So to start off then, see if we can, maybe we'll do it this way. So let's start with a baseline of basic economic case for immigration. On one level, it's the same as the basic economic case for trade in goods and services. So how many of y'all have taken a principles of economics course? Almost all of you, right? So international trade based on comparative advantage means you let people in different countries specialize in what they're their relatively low opportunity cost provider of. You swap goods between countries, and that makes the pie bigger for everybody. That same thing is also true with immigration. There's, in a way, immigration and trade in goods and services can be substitutes for each other. As Lucas mentioned in my introduction, my undergrad was from UMass Lowell, heart of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. There, the factories originally employed women who left farms in the 1830s. In the 1840s, it started employing Irish immigrants who were replaced by Italian immigrants, who were replaced with other Southern European immigrants, who were replaced with Eastern European and Jewish immigrants up until 1920. Around 1920, the United States closes off what had been our, essentially, we'll call it Ellis Island immigration policy, which didn't place quantitative restrictions on immigration, only qualitative in checking for disease and health status as people were entering the country. Once you close off the immigration, then the factories move to the workers rather than the workers moving to the factory. But that's one type of them where it's kind of substitutes on the margin. The other type is there's lots of things that you just can't trade internationally. Services have to be provided on site in large part. You can't outsource your lawn care to Mexico. If it's Mexicans who have a comparative advantage in doing lawn service, they have to be able to move to South Carolina in order to cut your lawn. Similarly, nanny services. People who are going to do childcare need to be able to move to where the child is. Similarly, agricultural products aren't equally well grown everywhere. If the laborers who have a comparative advantage in harvesting or tending to those crops don't live where the crops are, they need to be able to move to them. Simply being able to move the crops across the borders doesn't make up for that. But there's a bigger part of an economic case for trade and labor or migration that's different than the standard case based on comparative advantage, and that's based on place productivity. Countries around the world differ tremendously in how productive they are. And it's complicated, lots of factors go into this. I think particularly important ones are things like a large measure of economic freedom, security of property rights, a tolerable degree of the rule of law that go into ordering economic exchanges so that regardless of the skill of any particular human, they're better able to create value for others by interacting in the environment, in an economic environment where they can make exchanges that create this value. In some places in the globe, this is much harder to do because the rules of the game are different. In other places, it's much easier. So take a Nigerian out of Nigeria and move them to the United States, changing nothing about that person. Their average income goes up 1,000%. Same's true of a Haitian, For a Mexican to the United States, it's about 150%. It's not that they all of a sudden became more skilled or that their poverty in their origin country was because of their lack of skill. It was the environment in which they were operating that was limiting the amount of value they could create from others and hence the amount of income they could earn in that process. So this place premium, when we look across countries, a classic article on this looks at 42 different countries, cover about 1.5 billion people. The average gain to them in per capita income moving to the United States is about almost $14,000. Wage differences between the median country and that is about a factor of 4. Anytime when we see a place where people are free to move between countries, you don't see differentials bigger than 1.5. If the income differentials are bigger than that, people move to equilibrate. If we're getting income differentials of a factor of 4 on average across on median across these countries, it means there's big barriers to people moving. So what we've seen, and I live in Texas, and recently it's been Haitian immigrants on the Texas border that have been in the news a lot. People will talk about there's an open border. Now there is some chaos on the southern border of the United States, but to call it open, as in people freely pass, is clearly not true. You can't have wage differentials on average of a factor of 4 across countries that are open. Otherwise, people would move and equilibrate those. The United States border, for all intents and purposes, in a legal sense, is closed to most of the world's population, the vast majority, not just most, of the world's population. That's why the wait period for legal visas is so long, and that's why people pay coyotes $5,000 to $10,000 to get across the Mexican border, and many thousands more than that to come from places in Asia in order to get into the United States. So economists look at this and say these big productivity differences between places. What if people were free to move? Let's not use the phrase open borders, which implies willy-nilly jumping across the Rio Grande or something like that, but just non-quantitative restrictions. Ellis Island immigration. Come through legal checkpoints, get checked out, and we're not going to limit the quantity of people. Economists estimate if destination countries, richer countries in the world, adopted such policies, global GDP, basically there's a range of estimates, but on average, double global GDP, or GWP, I guess, because it's not domestic at that point, it's the whole globe. Double world output. There is no economic policy we could talk about that has the potential to create that much wealth. That's like a doubling of income that then is every year double the level it would have otherwise been and growing on top of that. It essentially ends global poverty and massively increases global output. If economists are anywhere near right about this, all the other problems that we could talk about in migration, and I do not deny that there's not problems, overcrowding in slums and cities, things that you can worry about, crime rates, things you can worry about, fiscal effects, whole bunch of other things we could talk about. Those could be real problems. But if we're talking about doubling global output, if we're creative about this and we're like, okay, there's some problems, might we use public policy in such a way to take some of those big gains and direct some of that money towards addressing the problem, rather than saying, you know what, screw it, we're going to leave a whole bunch of humanity in under $2 a day poverty and not let them move and not get these big global gains in output. I would say for most of these other problems, there are smarter ways to address it than saying leave people in origin countries and don't let them move. And in Q&A at the end, I can take questions about a bunch of those. But for the project of this book, what I take seriously is a question of what if those global gains aren't real? What if by letting lots of people move, it would undermine the productivity of place? So the very factors that make us productive in America and other destination countries, if those same factors that are responsible for the poverty of the origin countries, in part at least, stem from the ideas, belief, culture of the people who live there, if when they migrate to destination countries, they're not just workers, they're people, and they bring with them as people these cultural ideas and beliefs and influence our institutions, formal and informal, in the destination country in such a way that our rules of the game change. And they do so to look more like the origin country. And if that lowers our productivity of place, then this doubling of GDP is not there. And all of those other problems become even more problematic then, but even worse, What if they really bring down our productivity of place to look more like their origin country? Not only do they not get the gains, but everybody in the destination country becomes less productive and gets poorer too. So economists, most prominently George Borjas in this, have made this the quote new economic case for immigration restrictions. It basically, in econ speak, posits a negative externality of when workers move, they pollute the factors that contribute to the productivity of place. So let me make this more plain and like normal person speak. So let's take a concrete example. Cuba's poor. Cuba's poor mostly because it's socialist. When Cubans migrate from Cuba to South Florida, if they bring with them the beliefs that are responsible for Cuban socialism and they make Florida more socialist, Florida will become less productive. Not only will the immigrants escaping Cuba not earn as much, but they'll make existing Floridians less productive. And there's no global gains from this overall, but it actually could make the world a poorer place. Now, that's the hypothesis underlying this. And actually the case made by Borjas, Collier, and others, they don't give systematic evidence for it. They say it's complex what we understand about the factors that contribute to the productivity of place in poorer parts of the world. But these things, at least in part, stem from the formal and informal institutions that govern these places, which at least in part have to be related to the beliefs in the hearts and minds of the people. So far, I agree. And then the question is, when the people move, do those hearts and minds beliefs transfer with them and then impacts those institutions in the origin countries? Or now here's two alternatives. One, when the people move, do those other factors assimilate to the destination country that they're in? Or maybe even before they move, they've pre-assimilated and there's a selection bias to who moves. Rather than bringing the ideas of the origin country on average, they're the outliers. So I've already kind of given the game away a little bit in terms of an extreme counterexample of thinking about Cuban immigrants to Florida. I can think of no better anti-socialist voting bloc in the United States than Cuban immigrants in South Florida. I think that's probably an extreme case, but I think there's something going on like that selection bias in immigration more generally, of people who are moving not to consciously or even unconsciously recreate the institutions of the origin country, but are pre-selecting to come to the United States, not just for a better way of life, but also for the institutions that are there and not wanting to recreate the ones from the homeland. And what this book does, and I'm not going to read you the long quotes on this I've kind of already given you their basic case, is we're going to seriously consider this and say it's an empirical question. We don't know a priori. There's no economic theory that tells us yes or no on this. So let's investigate how it's going. And while we call it the new economic case for immigration restrictions, I give this talk to conservative audiences in Texas sometimes, and I point out, like, this is not like a new fear in the United States. Go back to founding fathers, and you can find them articulating multiple versions of this, and you can find people throughout US history articulating some version of this. What's new about it in terms of the economists is they tie it to the global gain stuff and say that this all goes away and it's a negative externality. But the underlying idea is old. This is Jefferson here. Immigrants will bring with them the principles of the government they leave, imbibed in their youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness, passing as is usual from one extreme to another. It would be a miracle if they were to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty, which is what he believed the US government was doing in 1787. Similarly, you can find Ben Franklin talking about swathery Germans bringing their beliefs with them. You can find this throughout John Jay, other ones in Federalists talking about things like this. So what we're going to do in the book, our contribution, me and I should say my co-author, Alex Nowrasteh at Cato Institute, the two of us started a series of papers, 7-8 years ago, that started to empirically investigate this. And each, academic journal articles make one point kind of narrowly that they can say, well, and we did this multiple times, and we started to say, we got something bigger to say. It belongs in the format of a book where we string these all together, rewrite them, and say, when we, each one taken individually says something very small, but when we put them together, it allows us to say something kind of bigger. And that's what this book project is that I'm presenting to you tonight, which is how do immigrants impact the institutions in destination countries in ways that might impact our productivity. It's not saying that they don't influence culture, they don't influence language, that they don't bring their cuisine with them or other things. It's about, do they affect the formal and informal institutions, so culture, to the extent that it matters for productivity in a way that changes the productivity of the destination countries. So we're going to have two main ways that we look at this. We're going to do it across countries. So we're going to look at about 110 countries, and we're going to look at initial stocks of immigrants accumulated over decades, subsequent flows of immigrants over about a 20-year span, and say, how does that impact the economic freedom in destination countries? How does it impact corruption in destination countries? How does it impact terrorism? And how does it impact culture, at least as culture relates to productivity? And there's going to be problems and limitations, which I'll say later, about each of these ways of investigating this. And then we're going to switch and we're going to say, let's take a different tack. Let's look at case studies of mass migration then in the United States prior to 1920, and then two more recent ones in the 1990s in Israel and Jordan, where big chunks of the population came in as immigrants in a very short period of time, and how do those influence these things? So first, we're going to look at economic freedom. So I'm sure Pete's had talks here before that have done economic freedom of the world stuff. Maybe some of you have been here, maybe some of you have not. But basically, this index is looking at what's the size of government like how high are your taxes and spending, how secure are your property rights, do you have high inflation or a stable monetary unit, do you have freedom to trade internationally, what's regulation of business, credit, and labor markets like? It's a composite that looks at all of these things together and does it for about 150 countries in the world. We look at it for what we can get data on 110 countries. We do this from 1990 to 2011. And we look at how does the initial stock of immigrants in 1990 impact the subsequent change in economic freedom? And then we say also, how does the inflow of immigrants over that 20-year period impact it? How does the stock and flow interacted together impact it? And we're going to control for some other factors while we do this, and also not very much at all, and say what it does. And now this is where the tables get ugly, and I won't bore you too much. There's actually 32 of these different ones in this particular paper that I'm summarizing. This gives you, with controlling for other political institutions, level of economic development. We do it without too. The story doesn't really change that much. Here's the punchline of kind of what we've, in fact, actually, I think the next slide's called punchline. Punchline of what we find when we do this. Out of the 32 different ways we specify it, we don't get a single instance of either the stock or the flow negatively impacting economic freedom in destination countries in a way that's statistically significant. More recently, I had another economist who criticized us on this, of quote, over controlling and trying to just show simple correlations between the two. But here's the problem when you do that with controlling for nothing else. Immigrants go from poor countries to rich countries because economic freedom is important for becoming rich. You're already, like, the immigrants are only going in one direction on this. So we have to control for initial levels, because if you're like a 9 out of 10 on the index, it's really hard to go up. It's really easy to go down. So control for levels, and then guess what? You're back to the world that we're in here. Nothing's relevant on this. And sometimes actually we get positive relationships. I don't really believe in that much, but we don't get the negative externality that the people are talking about in they're going to undermine our economic freedom in destination countries. Sometimes positive. And when it's positive, it's actually kind of like economically meaningful in terms of like oomph in magnitude. So using a 1 standard deviation increase in the immigrant stock, get about a 0.34 higher economic freedom score at a scale of 1 to 10. But 0.34 is actually like kind of significant difference in that index. Plug that into a regression that does the impact of economic freedom on investment and growth. And that's about a 0.5 percentage point higher annual economic growth rate. That to me seems like meaningful in magnitude. But it's the opposite of what this new case for economic restrictions on immigration is. Next one we did was corruption. And we played the same game, look across basically 110 countries where we can get the data. And do immigrants from more corrupt countries increase the corruption in destination countries? Or do they assimilate to that and have no effect? This was inspired in part, actually, one of my friends in graduate school. She was a Russian immigrant. This is more than 20 years ago. I remember her coming in all flustered to campus one day. And what was the matter? She's like, oh, I got pulled over by a police officer. It's like, I put $20 out the window when he came up to the car. This did not go well for her. Her reaction was to reach in her wallet and get another $20 and say, what, not enough? it got worse. I guarantee she did not make the same mistake again. I bet you see assimilated to the corrupt practices or lack thereof in the United States relative to her home country. And so this is our way of looking at this as a measure of corruption across countries and doing the same game that we played before. This is actually the same setup that we did. We look at averages across countries overall and OECD. And then as we went through and did more of these studies, we started breaking down the samples a little bit differently. We're like, okay, let's do the same exercise, but do it only from low income countries and to richer countries. So countries that are like a standard deviation poorer than their destination. Then let's do the same thing. You only come from more corrupt countries to less corrupt countries. See if you get an effect there. Punchline as we go across all of these, and there's different ways that we play this game. Basically, we get no effect on corruption. Next one we look at is terrorism. And we do this a couple of ways. One, we actually try to put it in perspective in terms of what the costs are. So even if there was a significant relationship between immigrants and terrorism, what the actual costs of terrorism are in the United States. This kind of sounds shitty, but it's true. Pretty trivial. 9/11 is a huge outlier. And even when you include that in the data, on average, the overall cost of this relative to the economic gains that we're talking about is minuscule. But then we play the same game. And this one, we do some other statistical techniques called instrumental variables of trying to separate out what's the causal effect of current immigration on rates of terrorism, but using, terrorists immigrants are more likely to go to less terror-prone countries. So given that they're more likely to go to less terror-prone countries, maybe looking at associations of current stocks and flows of immigrants isn't really showing the causal effect of the terrorism of the immigrants on the terrorism, but rather a selection bias if they go to nicer places that don't have that. A way you get around this, and this is as we go in through these different studies, we start doing more things over the years of, well, immigrants tend to go to places where they have people from their country already. So you can use stocks and flows, you can use existing stocks of immigrants by origin country in 1960, 1970 to look at like last 20 years of immigrant flows, because those two things are going to be related. But those immigrants who came in 1960, they cannot be doing terrorist acts in 2010. They're mostly dead or they're really old. So you don't have that type of causal thing. So we go through this anyway. Punchline is we don't get a relationship. And then we break it up by samples again. We're like, how about immigrants just from Muslim majority countries? Nope. How about from just conflict torn countries? Nope. How about Muslim conflict torn countries? Ready? Nope. Nothing there. And by the way, just like kind of intuitively, this makes sense. If you want to create an act of terrorism in another country, why the hell would you go through an immigration visa? Just go on a tourist visa. It's way lower cost to get. You go get your act done and be done with it. But the idea that like the immigrants are moving and then doing it's a higher cost way. Admittedly, you could move there and then get dissatisfied and stuff, but that's just not the norm. The culture one, we do a few different ways. And one is like the joke about the person looking for their keys under the street lamp because the light's there. So trust is something that economists and other social scientists measure as a measure of culture that could be related to productivity. I think there's actually all sorts of problems with this literature, but we look at it anyway in this of what's the relationship between trust and growth, and do immigrants undermine trust if trust is important for growth? But actually then, in what ways is trust important for growth? If you have really crappy institutions, like if you don't have contract enforcement and the rule of law, trust becomes way more important for economic activity. If you can trust courts to enforce contracts and the rule of law, well, then trust actually becomes less important. Well, if immigrants move from places that have bad institutions to places that have better formal institutions, even if they do degrade trust, maybe that's not very important for economic growth. So direction of causality on this here and the substitutability is kind of questionable. Also, I think there's a lot of trust assimilation. As immigrants move to higher trusting societies, they become more trusting. There's also a difference when you look at the data on this between generalized trusts. Is it generally okay to trust strangers versus do you trust the institutions, the courts, the laws, the government? Turns out actually immigrants tend to be lower trust in general, but higher trust in the institutions than the native-born people, at least in the United States. Overall, though, I don't really think much of this is meaningful. So that's one way, that's a very narrow view of culture that matters for productivity. Then we take the opposite view, or we take an opposite way of looking at it and saying, instead, we're going to just leave culture, this big black box, and say that it's somehow related to our ancestors. And other people have worked on this, and they say the importance of your deep roots of ancestry for economic development. So if a country's population had agriculture and certain technologies and certain forms of government in 1500 or years prior to that, how does that impact development today? So like if you have a long kind of civilized history, that's going to make you more productive today. So Putterman and Wales, the key study on this, on the state and agricultural history, and it's adjusted by ancestor geography. So like a place like the United States doesn't have a long history of that if you do just the literal land. But if you do it weighted by population and where their ancestors came from, well, then it does. So their exercise in looking at this says, oh, ancestry matters a lot. So some people have interpreted that to mean that, well, if we let a lot of immigrants from places that don't have a long state history like this come to places that do, that'll dilute our ancestry. And we don't really know about whether it's trust or whatever this black box is that's culture. It'll undermine the culture that gives us productivity and could make us poor. Some problems with this. If you just even read their own study, and by the way, they don't make it immigrant focused. It's people who work on this who want to use this externality argument of kind of hijacked it. But if you just read the original study, geography matters way more for output than the ancestry does. So moving people from bad geography to good geography still increases global output when you net these two effects out. The other thing that's really kind of important is that the results go away when you get rid of 3 outliers. Now, every statistical study has outliers. But when your outliers are China, India, and the United States, the 3 most populous countries in the world, that's kind of problematic. Presumably, we learn more from 330 million people in the United States than we do from however many people are in Luxembourg. Get rid of those. Actually, you don't even have to get rid of them. What you can do is you can reweight the regressions and run them by population, and then the results all go away too. Now, what's going on there? India and China have a long history of these things and a poor level of development. Also problematic in all of this, when we do the ancestry-based thing, most of this is based off conquest. That's very different than migration. You don't get that same self-selection of selecting in to move to a place because you like it there more. So I'm not really sure that this has much relevance for doing it. So all of these studies that I've talked about so far, I'll speed up to end in like 10 minutes or so, all have different limitations. All of them have what we call endogeneity issues for economists of perhaps it's immigrants self-selecting into this rather than the effects of immigrants. This is less of a concern when we talk about stocks of immigrants that are accumulated over decades before the period of analysis. Like your stock of immigrants in 1990 probably didn't come there over the previous 3 decades because they expected, let's say, economic freedom to improve from 1990 to 2010. Now with flows that are contemporaneous, that's probably more of a concern. But when we do the stocks, probably not as much, but not that you still couldn't construct such an argument. Maybe the trend line of your improvement was already there and they were responding to that. We try to deal with this a few different ways, but actually I think there's a more important limitation to all of these is the data comes from existing stocks and flows of migrants. Every destination country in the world today has managed migration, where they have significant qualitative and quantitative controls on migrants. So perhaps, while we don't get it out of the data from the cross-country stuff, if people came in big enough numbers, uncontrolled, well, then those effects would be there. We just don't pick it up now. That's plausible. However, I will say, before I go on to the next stuff, George Borjas basically gets to make shit up and add math. He says, maybe they bring this externality. I don't know. I'm going to formally model how much of this externality they bring, and then tell you how much that decreases output, without giving any evidence that this happens at all. Now, if I'm telling you that we come from I don't have a whiteboard here, but we'll play right here. if we've got a graph here, right, where it's like more immigrants coming and whatever happens on the vertical axis, the things that are related to productivity, and we have zero data and we just make shit up and add math, that's one thing. Getting stocks and flows from existing managed migrations is like getting the slope of the line on the first part of this. Now that doesn't tell you that when you go way out here, it might turn over and go negative or do something different. But it seems to me as a first start on this, get in the direction to start with is a step. So that's step one in the first half of the book. Next half of the book, what we're going to do is case studies. We're going to look at places where the numbers aren't small and aren't well managed. So mass migrations and how they impact institutions. So we look at the United States before 1920 and see what impact did mass migration in the United States have on institutions here. And some of this you can look just at, if we're going to do like economic freedom as our one, in fact, that's what I'll do throughout these 3 country studies as the way immigrants could impact it. I have Marx and Engels up there, and I'm going to favorably cite them in this talk, which is rare for me. I wrote another book called Socialism Sucks. And most people who read that book actually have no idea that I would do pro-immigration work and cite Marx favorably. But you can actually read letters from them to each other, bemoaning immigration to the United States and how it prevents the socialist movement from gaining better traction in the United States in the 19th century. Why? With a continuous pool of new low-skilled laborers coming in, it made it harder to have solidarity among the unions, who are the biggest political force for socialism in the United States. Now, it is true that most socialist activists and intellectuals were themselves immigrants during this time. It's also true that something like 3/4 of the people who the Socialist Workers' Party helped finance their immigration never joined the party when they got to the United States. They're like, screw it, we're in America, man, we're gonna make some money. But Marx and Engels were getting like, this is, so even like things we don't think about that much, but like in terms of like the unions pushing for recognized holidays, if you have people with different religions and different cultures moving in, they don't converge on the same ones. They're lobbying for different things and they become a less effective force for this. And they talk about this in the United States. And I think overall, they limit, and Marx and Engels basically say in Germany, we're more successful with this in the labor unions than we are in the United States. We can also look at federal and state expenditures and find that on the local level, it's negatively correlated with the size of the immigrant population. Also, if we look at like growth of the US government over time, prior to 1920, when the United States had mostly an open immigration policy, that was the period of slowest growth of government in the United States. From 1920 to 1965 is the most closed period of immigration. That's actually the highest period of economic size of government as a percent of the economy growth in the United States. I'm not claiming causal in this. You got 2 world wars and a Great Depression going on during this time. Post 1965, it's the intermediate case, both in terms of migration and government spending growth. There's not like a clear case that maps neatly from the negative externality thing that the restrictionists pose into the United States. The one I want to tell you a little bit more is about Israel, because this is a kind of cool natural experiment that's more recent. So so Israel always had what's called the law of return. So worldwide Jewish people are allowed to immigrate to Israel, and upon getting off the plane or boat, instantly have full citizenship with the right to vote and access to the welfare state. So if we're going to have this kind of political externality from immigration, this is like a really easy case for it. So they've always had this. So this is what makes it a natural experiment. Israel didn't change their policy because all of a sudden it was going to be beneficial to have immigrants. Something else changed. What changed was Soviet emigration restrictions. The Soviets stopped preventing people from leaving the country just before the country collapsed. So what you got was a mass migration of people coming from a country that has a 70-year history of no political freedom, no economic freedom, into Israel in the early 1990s. So this graph there, the orange lines from the former Soviet Union, the others, the total, basically the same. And it shows the big spike in 1989 through 91, but it remains high throughout the 90s. Basically, it's a 20% increase in their population over the course of a decade. This is no longer a small managed flow. This is a big one, and it's an exogenous shock. You don't have the endogeneity problems. So the obvious objection to this is like, dude, it's Israel. Come on, it's like all people who are Jewish migrating to the same place. Well, actually, when you read the sociologists who do like ethnographic work there and stuff, and look at the characteristics of the migration, They're not religiously or culturally homogeneous with the population that they're moving to. So the law of return also applies to non-Jewish spouses, non-Jewish children, and grandchildren, and their non-Jewish spouses. So you do not have to be a believer to qualify. And coming from the Soviet Union, very few of them were religious. Most of them were atheists and agnostics. About half of them said they would have rather gone somewhere else, but they just went there because that's where they were allowed. In terms of language, under 15% of them spoke a Jewish language. They all spoke Russian. Russian news media outlets proliferate in Israel at this time. So they're not either culturally or religiously homogeneous. This isn't like a Zionist project move to Israel type mass migration. This is a Soviet Union doesn't have much opportunity. We're free to leave. Let's get the hell out of here. We got more opportunity there. So a lot of normal push moves. What does make it different than comparing to what we could call third world mass migration is they were relatively educated. So they had higher levels of literacy and also technical education. They couldn't always use it in terms of professions, but they were educated, at least disproportionate compared to low skill migrants from third world countries. That's what's more unique than the religious or cultural aspect of it, I think. So, by the way that paper came about is I sent one of these earlier papers to George Borjas, who wrote me back. He's like, Professor Powell, that's interesting. It's got all of the drawbacks and all the benefits of any cross-country study. What I'd really like to see is a large exogenous shock of mass migration and what that does. And I'm reading the email, I'm like, Israel? Like, not like rocket science here, like economists have used Israel to understand how immigrants impact housing prices, labor market effects. Like, just no one's done enough. So the very first thing I do is I'm like, freetheworld.org, let's pull up the little index and take a look. Well, before we do any fancy statistical stuff, we just take a look and it's like, they improved 45% in the 1990s. Now the 90s were a decade of increasing economic freedom globally, but they go from 15% below to 12% above the global average, shooting up more than about 47 spots in the rankings. And when we look across areas, every area but one improved significantly. The one that didn't was size of government. And when you dig into it, the reason why, it's not because they changed their policies. It's because the immigrants were poorer and they qualified for welfare. So transfer spending went up. Transfer spending policy didn't change, just the raw dollar amount being transferred did. As a result, the economic freedom score in that area went down. Once the immigrants were economically assimilated, because policy didn't really change, it rebounds to what it was before. So broadly across, there was either no effect or a positive effect. And we do something on this one, and we do the same thing on Jordan, of what we call synthetic control analysis of so I wrote this other book on the socialism thing, and you have North and South Korea. That's like a natural experiment where you got one peninsula, one culture, one history, one language, basically one geography, a little bit different weather and terrain, but call it one place. And one of them's like socialist and one's capitalist, and you see the difference, and you can see it from a satellite. Usually we don't have those things. We don't have two Israels. What we really like is two Israels, one who gets the mass migration and one who doesn't. Synthetic control is basically a way to do fake Israel and real Israel. So we're going to create a weighted average of countries that are similar economically to Israel, such that that weighted average tracks real Israel's performance and economic freedom prior to the migration wave. And then we're going to let that go free at the migration wave and say, which one changes more? That's what this is doing. And the dotted line is the fake Israel. The solid is the real. Real Israel improves economic freedom a whole lot more, giving you more confidence that the immigration actually was the cause of this change in economic freedom. And then we can play with it a couple different ways, doing moving the interventions in time, seeing if we did the same type of test for every country in the donor pool, how Israel stacks up with them, and they're the big fat line that's the outlier on all of that. And sometimes you really don't need this fancy stuff. Like looking at the Israel one, here's like a smoking gun to me. You have two political parties, a left and a right party, that are damn near a dead heat before the immigrants come. You change the voting population by 20%. That's going to shift the median voter. If the Soviets want to recreate Soviet socialism in Israel, it's going to move them left. If they don't, it's going to move them right. Well, guess what? The Labor Party, which is the more socialist party, used to use red in their campaigns. They purged the color red from their campaign advertising. This tells me that the Soviets were rebelling against the idea of Soviet socialism, not wanting to recreate it. Don't need fancy statistical techniques to kind of pick that out of there. And they were a member of the ruling coalition governments starting in the mid-90s. They had their own seats in the legislature, et cetera. I won't tell you the story because I'm running out of time. Jordan, it's a similar story. It's Gulf War #1 and Kuwaiti Palestinians who had Jordanian passports who moved back, and it's about a 10% surge, who are excluded from government and bureaucratic roles, but participate in markets and push for more market reform. There's limitations to each of the case studies. The United States is 19th and early 20th century before there's a big welfare state. Israel is a particular type of mass migration. It's not unrestricted migration from the world. Listen, if you had open migration from the Arab world to Israel, Israel would soon cease to be Israel. But it's a type of mass migration. Ditto with Jordan. So now we're replacing endogeneity concerns with external validity concerns. But what we start doing on getting a big picture out of the book is saying, as we look at this overall, we've got some people who say that there's a new case for new case for immigration restrictions based on this externality. They haven't given empirical evidence for it. We've tried a few different ways to see if there's much evidence for it. We don't find it. There's no QED here. Doesn't mean that you couldn't find some bilateral flow of immigrants from some origin to some destination that do have this negative effect. But it does cast skepticism on the general claim that greater immigration will degrade the institutions. And in fact, in the conclusion, we play with the idea of, if you do find this evidence, how do you deal with it? The implication, at least implicitly, or the way that people use this new case for immigration restrictions is, well, if they might degrade our institutions, then we should stop immigration or really cut it back. Well, if it's not a general case, if it's a specific one, it would look more like you would either quantitatively or qualitatively cut back the migration flow that generates that negative externality while leaving the rest of it in place. So just playing with ideas and not claiming that there is this externality there, but like, let's just think about migration to the United States versus migration to Europe. There's a lot of Latin American migration to the United States. If someone made the case that this was starting to generate, which I don't think it is, but if they made the case that it was starting to generate this negative externality of degrading US institutions because of Latin American migration, well, the answer would be quantitatively or qualitatively limit that migration while practicing free migration with the rest of the world. If Europe, which has very few Latin American immigrants, which does have a lot of Middle Eastern and Muslim North African immigrants, is experiencing that, well, they cut back on that number, but open up to Latin American ones. In terms of the global gains, the productivity gains of going from Latin America to the United States or Europe are on par, not the same, but close enough when we're talking about the differences from origins to destinations. Ditto from North Africa to the United States instead of Europe. The world's just about as wealthy, and you've dealt with this problem without stomping out migration. Now, I don't think that's optimal, and I think it requires evidence, but it's just playing with the idea of, if you're going to give this type of evidence, this would probably be a better way to address it. And I will say, I do think Europe has more significant problems with the migration that they're experiencing than what the United States does. They're not in our, they're in our data, but in terms of the most recent surge, they're not in there yet in terms of measuring the change in like economic freedom stuff, because there's just not enough years of data to do that yet. But my casual read on the European stuff is that labor market regulation plays a big deal. So the United States is a more flexible labor market. Bring immigrants to the United States, you integrate them to the labor market, they integrate in other ways too. In Europe, you have high minimum wages relative to productivity. You have laws where in some countries, refugees don't have permits to work. And you have worker dismissal laws where it's impossible to fire workers, so you don't take a risk when you're hiring them in the first place. For students, just imagine that if you want to go on a date with somebody, you first have to promise to marry them with no possibility of divorce. Welcome to the world of what a French employer is when they hire an employee. So what that makes you do is not take a chance on immigrants. Well, what's this do? It leaves them out of the labor market. So what do? They enclave, they look to each other. They resent the society that's there. The society resents them, and you get in a bad kind of spiral. And I think it has I'm not saying it's all this, but that is a big portion of more difficulties in Europe than in the United States. So I will wrap up there and take questions with basically saying the presumption of the economic case for free migration is that it massively increases global output. That's not to say there aren't other problems, but if we massively increase global output, we can deal with most of those problems. The bigger objection to this is global output doesn't really go up that much because they screw up our productivity of place. I'm saying not much evidence for that as far as I can tell so far. So with that, I will conclude and take questions from here on out, Pete.
So we're going to ask that if you have questions, that you come to one of the microphones either here or there. So we're open to anybody that wants to queue. If any of our market process scholars have questions, we generally defer to them first. So if they want to come up, any of them want to come up, but please come up on the microphone and ask a question.
All right.
So I would ask, you only showed us two examples of really large exogenous shocks of immigration, Israel and Jordan. And in both cases, it seemed like there was an undue kind of explosion in economic freedom. So why aren't you making a stronger case for the fact that maybe large economic shocks actually have a really positive impact on economic freedom?
Because I'm not sure that they do. I'm not willing to extrapolate that much from those two. What I am willing to say is those are two where you have really easy cases where if you were going to get the negative shock, you could get it, and instead we see the opposite. I think it's a fair question, and if this is all we had data on, and maybe I guess it kind of is, maybe we could make a stronger case that way, but I'm not going to feel that strong about it because I don't pick it up on the cross-country stuff the same way. I pick it up much more as a shrug on the cross-country stuff.
Thanks.
How you doing, sir? Thorin Corrente here. I had a question about one part is, are you finished with like researching with what you have kind of looked into? And two, do you want to take it to like maybe Congress, or like what is your goal with the ending result of like how you want to finish your research?
Yeah, I have no desire to go to Congress ever, or DC for that matter. So no, I don't view this as like a finished research program, but in a sense, actually, on a personal level, it kind of is close to that. Like I've done a series of research articles working on this stuff, and when I thought I basically had a good story put together, I pulled it together in a book, along with Alex, who's also been independently doing these together and stuff. It's not quite like the other thing that I presented here years ago was on my sweatshop stuff, and I had done research on that for a while. And when I wrote the book on that, I was kind of like, I'm done with it. I've said it, but I did think there was much more of a QED at the end of that. This one, I don't think there is, which means it is more open, but I don't have a new study in process right now on next step. I've got some ideas of some that I might do, but they're not well established yet. So I don't know, what's the goal of it is to communicate that like we can take seriously this objection to immigration, investigate it and talk about it and improve communication about it. Basically toss the ball back into the court to people who say, this must be the case. Say, what's your evidence for it? Now, I also do think, by the way, in terms of, I didn't say it in here, but I have at dinner or whenever we've been talking before, thinking about this like domestically in the United States. If I were given this talk in Texas, I would have spent more time talking about interstate migration. I guess this might be something that's relevant to you in South Carolina too, with New Yorkers moving down here these last 2 years. But in Texas, this is a big deal about them worrying about Californians moving to Texas. And you'll notice I haven't said anything about political parties, maybe other than the Israel sense a little bit during any of this talk. I don't like measuring policy by blue or red and stuff. They're all a mixed bag. But Texans in particular are concerned about like the state turning purple as liberals from California move to Texas. And when I talked to them there about this, you know, there's 49 states people from California can move to. When they choose Texas, like Texas is a thing. You get guns and beef. If you're a vegan hippie, you're not like, oh, I want to move to Texas. Like if you just don't like the high cost of living in California, go to California or Oregon, you can have granola. So like the interstate in migration to Texas I'm like, yeah, I mean, they bring some avocado toast and stuff, so they're not in line with barbecue with me, but that's cool. But when you actually look at like their voting patterns and stuff on this, like in the Senate race, the big one with Ted Cruz and O'Rourke that was contested, then this was like evidence of Texas turning purple. Non-native born Texans voted for the Republican at a higher rate than the native born Texans did. This tells me it's a selection bias of which Californians are moving to Texas. Ditto, they're more, and I don't think this is either good nor bad, but in terms of thinking about the selection bias, non-native born Texans are more likely to identify as conservative than native born Texans. This doesn't fit the story that people in Texas talk about these Californians coming in. And I think this one's a real clear story, even more so than international migration, of selection bias. If you're choosing among 49 states to go to and you're like, Texas, you're not the one who's going to turn Texas to look like California. I think Florida probably is experiencing something similar, but maybe not quite as clear cut as the Texas one. And that's because Florida isn't as clear cut. And you got lots of Northeast migration for a long time down there for lots of reasons of snow, and for that matter, Midwestern snowbird type stuff. But like Florida, man, is actually kind of like an equalizer during COVID. He looks insane during normal times, but then during COVID, like Florida man's like, oh, that's actually like rational kind of. It's a blend. You guys aren't nodding with me, so you guys think Florida man's crazy. All right, cool. Sorry, I went a little bit long on your question there, but I was playing with some implications of it.
So accepting the fact that immigration is a good thing, so hypothetically, the fact that the United States accepts any number of immigrants from, say, Nigeria or where have you, there is going to be a net gain in the United States. Have you done any research into the economic outcomes for the donor countries? So is Nigeria better off? Well, I'm leaning towards no. So what can be done about that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's not part of this talk because this one's very centric on how it impacts the wealth and destination countries. But if it was the case, so it could go this way, right? That by educated Nigerians leaving Nigeria, it dooms Nigeria. One, they lose their human capital, and two, any hope of institutional improvement in Nigeria goes to hell. That's possible. I don't think so. Actually, and in terms of a new research one, what I would like to do is immigrant stocks and flows in institutions in origin countries. I suspect there's nothing there on that, but I don't know that one. What I do think when we look at just the economics without the institutional aspect of it, like the brain drain phenomenon of like the educated person leaving and taking their skills with them, we have to one, realize that the gains to the immigrant in the destination country aren't the losses of the origin, precisely because of the productivity of place. Like that your income goes up by a factor of 1,000% doesn't mean that the origin country lost that money. That wasn't going to be there. But the really big one that I think in this is remittances. So remittances run about $500 billion per year now. So this is when immigrants come to a destination country and send money back to family, relatives, friends in origin countries. That's about a factor of 4 bigger than all World Bank, USAID, IMF, all of the governmental and non-governmental aid programs to poorer countries. So remittances are a much bigger flow, and it doesn't go through corrupt governments. It goes from people to people who have better incentives and better information. And I think that more than makes up for, at least without thinking about institutional impacts of just economic impacts, more than makes up for it in the origin countries.
So just to follow up, remittances only exist because people can't bring their families with them, right? You're not, if you can bring your family with you, why not? And just as a second part to that, do you think that there's a point in a hypothetical world where you open immigration, past which if people start leaving, then it just triggers a downward spiral where more people leave and more people leave because the opportunities elsewhere are so much better that it just decreases the opportunities to which the donor countries, there's nothing left?
Yeah, maybe, but that's cool. And I mean, that's cool in like a sincere sense. Like we see this, so in like the United States has free migration between cities and towns throughout the United States. I live in West Texas. You can drive through places that are ghost towns and other hollowed out towns, but it would be better for them to be a ghost town than to be a vampire town. A vampire town would be where you make the humanities stay there and there's nothing productive for them to do because of the environment, versus a ghost town where you let them leave and they become productive and flourish out elsewhere. So with greater migration, if you can't bring family, friends, and others, if you can bring everybody in every number, and you start emptying out, listen, Antarctica doesn't produce much GDP. No one gives a damn. I mean, we don't walk around and be like, oh, I wish penguins were richer, right? There's no humanity there. It's not about the geographic development of a piece of geography. And I'm not attributing this to you. I'm just playing with the idea here of the piece of geography. It's about the humanity on the piece of geography. And if every Haitian moves out of Haiti into another country and becomes richer, I would call that Haitian economic development, even though the half of Hispaniola that is Haiti doesn't have any economic activity on it. And I'd be cool with that because I'm evaluating it by the humans, not by the piece of land. But I think about the vampire town versus the ghost town effect. And what we're basically doing with restrictive immigration policies is condemning countries to being vampire countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I kept looking that way. I didn't even know.
Well, Dr. Powell, I really enjoyed your talk tonight. I actually do a lot of work at the border. I'm going down there tomorrow to McAllen. And the question I had, what I've seen a lot down there is when we restrict immigration, on one hand, as you were mentioning, we don't have open borders, so it actually increases the power of the state and increases government as far as enforcing those borders. The bigger issue I've seen is with the corruption that comes with those restricted borders. So with the cartel really controlling immigration. So I don't know, I was wondering if you've done any work on that, looking how corruption increases and also how government expands with more restricted immigration.
Not specifically, and I don't really think I have a good quote answer to the question this way, except that I guess and I don't think you're mistaking this, but just to clarify what I'm talking about is I think a lot of those problems that we see on the border right now pretty much go away if you don't have quantitative restrictions, but you have legal checkpoints.
Right.
So everybody who can come in, as long as you're not a known criminal terrorist and you can test disease free or whatever, comes through a legal checkpoint, a lot of this other corruption and other stuff goes away. Right. And that a lot of the, and this push and pull motives, right? The economic opportunities in the United States are a pull. The push is the poverty and not just the poverty, but the crime, corruption, and everything else in the origin. And the US government plays a role in that too. I mean, I think the US, if we wanted to lower the illegal immigration pressure on the United States, ending the war on drugs from the United States would play a big role in that. Because that contributes to the crime and corruption throughout Latin America that creates the push motive in the first place.
Right. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. All right, you're up now.
So keeping to your example, you talked about Israel and Jordan. I thought it was interesting in the Middle East. Can we go to a more modern example of the UAE, which with the recent discovery of oil has brought in a lot of foreigners outpacing the actual population in skill and the amount of creative output, basically. So my question is, with this huge influx into a country that's ruled by a monarchy or semi-dictatorial, and with not really strong institutions, once such thing that has drawn all this migration, and whenever say the world moves on from oil, would this leave the migration onto hippie scotch, basically moving on to the next best country, or will it retain their thing, so to speak? If that's confusing, I know it was a little bit confusing, but
yeah. So UAE has a huge percent of the population as non-native born, and they're there as workers. And when those work opportunities dry up and there's better ones somewhere else, they probably would move on. But I'm making no prediction about when that happens or what that shuffle is. And of course, that presumes that they could move on to somewhere else. The UAE has been very welcoming to foreign workers. So, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to. So it's not one of my studies because I don't think they got them all at once in the quick year surge to have the thing on institutions that I was trying to look at in the Israel and Jordan cases.
Thank you.
But they are in the cross-country studies.
They're on the cross-country.
Yeah. All right, last question.
Hi. Towards the beginning, you were mentioning the idea of Ellis Island style immigration and the idea of using more of a quality check rather than a quota or quantity limit. And I was just curious how important the quality check or the characteristics of a quality check were for the double world output estimation.
Not.
Not?
Now, in the economist simulations of it, they actually do like nothing on that. It's numbers and elasticities that they pump through it. But to elaborate on it a little bit, I want to be clear on my quality check thing, or qualitative check thing rather than quantity. Because some people will talk about like Canada's migration system that uses a point system to allocate quality points. I think this is a huge mistake. When I say qualitative restrictions, I mean not a known criminal, not on a terrorist watch list, does not have a contagious disease that has a significant contagion possibility in the United States. That's it. When Canada does its scoring on educational attainment, language, profession, all this other stuff, and some people will say like Canada's system works. Like, what do you mean by works? Like, it ensures quality immigrants that match what they need. I'm like, no, it ensures immigrant mix that matches whatever government planners chose. But like, I don't know why the government planners can centrally plan an international labor market any better than the Soviet Union could centrally plan shoe production. In fact, I strongly suspect they're going to be worse at the international labor market than that. Incidentally, by the way, last I checked, I did not qualify for a visa to Canada, which is maybe correct. I don't know, but I'm not their type of. They know what it's all about. All right, with that, guys, thank you all for participating tonight.